Welcome back to Points of Intersection, Eli Kunisch. Good to have you in this new space, my outfitted office. Been working hard to get it ready for you, so welcome.
Well, I'm a little impressed, but I might need to paint the walls. I see you have Grandpa's lamp, and you got a nice selection of books.
Yep, I've been working on it, but I think you suggested wood paneling for the background and the walls in here, so maybe one day that'll happen.
Yeah. That would be nice.
Yeah. So I think initially I asked you to do a podcast on Sam Harris again. We've talked about him in previous episodes, but I was in the middle of a book of his called The Moral Landscape, and I knew that you were reading Waking Up. So we are not comparing the same book by Sam Harris, but I imagine he kind of has his philosophical bent and his area of study and focus of his studies. I want to talk to you about that, and then you thought of the idea today of doing it on sufficient reason. So if you'd want to tell us a little bit about that and what you had in mind for discussing sufficient reason.
Yeah. So what I mean by sufficient reason is that when we look at a proposition, any proposition really, is there a God? Is COVID-19 a serious issue? Is global warming a mainly man-made problem that we're facing? These all have reasons and justification and statistics to back them up. But I really wanted to look into with you, at what point do people commit to that proposition? At what point do people say, okay, I do believe and support this proposition, one way or the other? And one thing that I found is interesting in my own mind is that I've realized that when it comes to sufficient reason, that moves up and down on the spectrum depending on how much you would like to believe that. So just to kind of frame it, I would like very much to believe that there is a God. So for me, my sufficient reason, my level of evidence, and the
kind of the threshold before you're ready to believe it.
That's a good way to put it. Is a lot lower than someone like Sam Harris, who is a skeptic and seems to have a bent towards not wanting to believe that.
Yeah, definitely. I have quite a few things to say about that. I think that's a very good intro, and your point about, like that threshold kind of shifting for people based on what they previously hold. We all have that like confirmation bias. When we see evidence of one thing or another, we want it to point toward our previously held belief. And there's also like the cognitive dissonance involved in that is the dissonance between what we already believe and the new evidence going to overwhelm us toward like doubling down on our belief or changing our belief based on the new evidence. And the I think connection with Sam Harris there for me is that I'm actually in the process of trying to complete a book about God existing, and so my aim is to finish that by the end of this year. But that was actually based on a conversation he had with Gary Taubes, who is Gary Taubes is a nutrition kind of expert, and he was on Sam Harris's podcast. And, you probably listened to that episode, right? Because you said you listened to most of them.
I do. I skipped a few, and I might have skipped one on nutrition.
Yeah.
It might not have been in my wheelhouse or something that caught my eye.
Yeah. It was called What Should We Eat? And the reason... So I didn't, expect that from that particular episode. You'd expect, conversations about God from, between neuroscientists or... between like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. Like obviously you'd expect that, but yeah. So Gary Taubes actually issued this challenge. He said, if somebody wrote a book with a ton of research explaining why God exists, would you be able to read it? And Harris responded with, it would be a professional obligation of mine to read it, just based on his line of work. But then Taub said, yeah, I would have a really hard time reading it because I was raised a militant atheist. My mother raised me to think the same as her. And so that's kind of like admitted subjectivity, whereas you hear a lot of like subjectivity in belief in God and belief in a religious set of beliefs. You hear a lot of like subjective, well, how can you believe that based on evidence, blah, blah, blah. But even a scientific and a non-religious view has subjectivity to it in that sense, based on where you're coming from.
Well, that speaks to also authority, the authority that's giving you the information. Mm. So with Sam Harris and his aspiration to read a book that has hopefully good information on the existence of God, he would need to respect the source in order to even pick up the book, I would assume. Because Sam Harris, I'm sure, doesn't have the time or the patience to go through every apologetics book.
Right.
And most of them, you would get very tired very quickly with most of the stuff that comes out.
Yeah.
Just from what I've read in apologetics.
You might want to start with like Saint Anselm and then like Descartes, just the ontological arguments there.
Yeah, you could start with the primary arguments and just see where those lead. But there's a big idea of you can't listen to everybody's argument. You can't pick up everybody that says, hey, I believe this thing, and look at all this evidence. If Sam Harris did that with every Christian that wrote him, he would spend all of his time reading apologetics from every single person. And the same is to be said about any other proposition, is that we have to respect the source and see them as someone that is worth taking the time to go through their arguments and judge their validity.
Somehow Jordan Peterson enters the conversation when we have these conversations because he's just like in that same circle as Sam Harris. One second. It's interesting because Jordan Peterson is someone that Sam Harris was willing to have the conversation with. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And that was. Do you think that was a fruitful, interesting conversation?
Some of them were.
Yeah. Those debates that they had in Toronto.
One thing that is very hard for me to listen to is talking over people. And Jordan Peterson is very prone to interrupting.
That man's a saint.
Just kidding. But it's hard for me to listen to those debates, but there are portions that are very productive. And it's interesting that Sam Harris respects Jordan Peterson enough to have those conversations. 3 of them, right?
I think there were 4 nights total. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jordan Peterson, vice versa. And so Sam Harris respects the type of argument that Jordan Peterson is presenting.
Yeah. One problem that I actually have with Sam Harris, and well, let me just finish what I was saying about Jordan Peterson. So I was listening to Steven Pinker lately, and he was talking about, do you base your belief system on reason or not? And why is Pinker and why is Harris, why are those two thinkers Enlightenment thinkers? And so the interviewers were asking Pinker about Enlightenment thinking, and he said, Jordan Peterson is explicitly and by his own admission a counter-Enlightenment thinker, which I found interesting because we kind of know the ideas of the Enlightenment, an emphasis on reason, an emphasis on the individual as a like worthwhile entity, like those things, and it was a step toward the scientific revolution, basically. And Jordan Peterson being a counter-Enlightenment thinker, I don't know if I have heard him say that exactly, but it's interesting to think about, are there things that you can use as evidence besides reason, besides the scientific method? Are there things in human understanding and just reality more broadly that can be used as evidence? My number one candidate in that category would be time and what persists through time. Pragmatically, I think you have to give religion, and in the case of Sam Harris, he doesn't really give religion the time of day to say that it has any validity. But I think religion is something that is, from the dawn of humanity up until the present day, very strong in human life. And to me, that is some kind of evidence that there's something there. Whether that is a single God or whether it's just the inclination for humans to find meaning in their lives, I think that is up for debate. But I don't know if you can look at something that's persisted through all of human history and kind of just flip it to the side and say it doesn't matter, or it's backwards thinking. What do you think about that? That idea of something that persists through time having more validity than something that doesn't?
I think that as a general premise, I would definitely agree with that. I don't think that something can get into the zeitgeist. And so what I mean by zeitgeist is the modern spirit of a community or a society. And the things that are within the zeitgeist, they tend to pass away and be replaced by things that people are more interested in. Religion has waned and it has reemerged, but the fundamental inclination has stayed the same. I found it very interesting. I was listening to a great courses lecture on the French Revolution, and they started talking about how in the French Revolution they really tried to push Catholicism out of their society, but then they had to come to terms with the fact that a thinker like Rousseau, who's considered maybe the most powerful anti-Enlightenment thinker, he still provided the room for religion as a social driver that people need to maintain reality, to maintain morality and a functional society. And so, and even someone like Robespierre, the leader of the terror in the French Revolution with the guillotine and all of that, he still led a parade to the Supreme Being. He didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. He didn't support Catholicism, but he didn't want to go so far as to say we can throw out religion overall. And some of his fellow Jacobins really hated that idea, and that might be why they turned against him in the end. But
or Jacobians, that's how I would pronounce it. But you've probably heard professors say Jacobins.
Well, it's Jacobins.
Oh, okay, my bad. Glad we settled that.
No, I'm not sure which one it is.
I
would have to ask a French person.
Yeah, I was just clarifying that in my mind that was the connection, but
yeah. So I think that pervasiveness throughout time, it does show the rugged nature of religion, that it maintains even though we change definitions. There's fundamental aspects that can be argued for. And there's a podcast host named Jonathan Peugeot. I think you should take a look at him. You actually told me that you think you saw him with Jordan Peterson in some of his first podcasts.
Yeah, I heard him early on in the Jordan Peterson podcast, and you sent me some more things of his in the last couple months.
Yeah.
And I looked into some more.
Yeah, but there is a real
interesting take on Kanye that he has. But,
I wasn't sure if you would like that or not.
I did. I think anytime you can take abstract concepts and apply it to more broadly socially understood concepts, that is helpful to just say that these things are alive and well. It's not just yesteryear they did it this way or they believe this, but you can apply it to, in that case, he said Kanye is the fool, classically. It's this very eccentric person who is innovative and creative, and then, just like grabs people's attention. So the listeners can go and look at that commentary if they want. Was that his personal podcast? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it's just Jonathan Peugeot.
And it's called like Symbolism in the Real World.
The Symbolic World.
Symbolic World.
Yep. Yeah. But I wanted to get back to the Enlightenment. I forgot something. I think it's interesting that the Enlightenment is the only era in human history where they named themselves. They gave themselves the title of Enlightenment. And in that, I think that there is an ideal or an aspiration that is far too weighty for them to actually achieve it. And Descartes shows this beautifully in a discourse on method. He breaks down, if we take everything out of the equation, what can I know for sure merely based on reason? And the only thing he can come up with is I think, therefore I am. And that is the only thing that you can know perfectly, that you can know completely. Kant would
not even that I am a human being, but just that I am.
Right. Just that I think, and therefore I am a thinking thing, and therefore I exist. Which I found to be encouraging. And
knowing that you exist.
People think it's pithy, but honestly, he started the argument about simulation theory and all of that. It's all in Discourse on Method in the 16th century.
You said Descartes,
yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
Just double check.
Descartes. But so if we look at that, and Kant would come back and say that we know intuitively time and space. Those are our preconditions for understanding anything in the world. And so we know those intuitively for a fact. But he stopped there, kind of. And but the Enlightenment wanted to take that process and only value things that we can see from a reasonable perspective, from a rational perspective. And now we see a lot of people re-emerging that are saying we can't do that. We have assumptions and we have beliefs that have to be based on a priori facts that we cannot prove. Earlier we were going through a message thread about consciousness and about free will. And that is one of those things that if you look at it from a rational perspective, then you can't even prove free will. And our whole judicial system and idea about life and how we interact with others are right now based upon the reality of free will.
Yeah. Well, why would you punish someone who doesn't have the will to make that choice?
At least as an individual. How could you say that they are in a place where they can be justly punished?
Yeah. That really, if I think about that too deeply, it just puts my mind in a loop, because to think that and actually make a change also requires free will. Like if you go back to the first cause and say that everything is determined after the first cause, then somebody punishing another person based on their action is also predetermined. So it's just like interesting. How do you reform the judicial system if that's true?
Who's the psychologist that did Beyond Blame and Praise? B.F. Skinner. Is it B.F. Skinner? Yeah. So B.F. Skinner did a book called Beyond Praise and Blame. And his idea was that there is no such thing as free will. So we cannot judge individuals on that basis. So what would the alternative look like if we can't do that? So my idea is that if we throw out free will, then we throw out the mechanisms necessary in our judicial system. And so even if we can't prove that, we have to believe it in order to make these things work. And even if it isn't true, then if we throw that out, everything crumbles around us.
Which you would think also, just going back to like pragmatism, you would think that that tells you something about its validity and soundness. Is if you do away with a thing, somehow it's foundational and things will crumble around it, that means something. So that's another reason why I just, like, at the end of the day, I have to, well, just talking about a sufficient reason, I think it's sufficient enough for me to say, without free will, life itself doesn't make sense. And going back to Sam Harris also, he said in the moral landscape, he thinks that there are choices and better and worse choices, but no free will. And I didn't fully get the connection there, because I don't know how you make choices without free will, and we talked about that a little bit in our thread. But if it is true that there is no free will, that just seems like a stoppage to me. And I understand how it makes sense scientifically. Like, you can't, there's a causal chain and you basically can't get outside of that, because that's how scientific understanding is. But I just wonder, and this is something I said to you in that message even, I wonder if science will one day give more evidence for free will. And there's some things like in quantum mechanics and just randomness theory gives some idea to the possibility of there being free will. It seems like the most accepted, well, I wouldn't even say that. I guess it's still a debate in the scientific community, as far as I understand, as to whether there's free will or not. But yeah, as far as like following strictly the causal chain and all of that, that it doesn't exist.
I have a hard time understanding how science could even approach something like free will. Because in my understanding of free will, it's contingent upon the existence of the soul. Because there has to be something above and beyond the causal chain. Because you have to, in order to have free will, you have to be able to transcend the causal chain. And that means that this thing, whatever it is that we call the soul, is outside of natural causation. And however little I understand science and the scientific method, I'm pretty sure it's bracketed within the causal chain. And bracketed within natural events. Because you do an experiment, and it needs to be repeatable and provable by other people. And you have to be able to look at things directly. And on those grounds, I guess quantum physics and such things as that would kind of break that boundary. Going back to Sam Harris, in Waking Up, which is a book that I just finished, he has a chapter on consciousness.
You gave it a 3 out of 5 on Goodreads, by the way?
I gave it a 3 out of 5 because if you're looking to get into something like meditation or mindfulness, his content on that is great.
Yeah.
It is amazing to look at the range and the possibilities of meditation and mindfulness when it comes to observing yourself and interacting with the world and really looking at how you respond to things and being able to segment your thoughts and watch them pass. But he has a chapter on the consciousness, and he, from what I understand, he doesn't completely believe that it's real. He makes it very clear that the self doesn't exist. But he leaves room for consciousness as some type of phenomena.
Mm.
And maybe this is something you could explain to me, but I've never really been able to get a clear definition of consciousness.
Hmm.
The only thing that I've been able to really figure out is that it's self-aware in some way.
Mm.
But essentially what he talks about is that he says, like, where is it? Is it inside my head somewhere? Is it in my eyes? Is it does it stop at my skin?
Is it the homunculus? Does he bring that up in the book?
Homunculus. Maybe.
It's like the little guy inside all of us that is at the controls, basically.
Well, that guy's kind of scary, but...
That guy's a tyrant.
But consciousness, again, is something that we feel, but we don't really even know what it is.
Mm. I was going to ask earlier, like, when you said the idea of free will and choice is necessitated, or it necessitates the idea of a soul.
Well, the soul comes first and then free will.
Right, yeah. So would you think that, and I want to, like, get into your question, but I'm just thinking, like, to set kind of some ground rules here. Do you think that, like, bunny rabbits have free choice? Do you think that dogs have free choice? Or are they following strict reactionary impulses and instinct?
Descartes actually talks about this in the Discourse on Method. He calls them the beasts, and he sees humans as independent causal agents, and the beasts as essentially automaton, robots that just respond to stimulus and they process it, and here pops out a response to it. And I do believe that. Yeah, I'd say that I believe there is something special in humans' ability to introspect and to think about the future in ways that are more complicated than pain response. So we as humans, when we have pain, we understand the implications of that pain. And so if we cut an artery and we see blood pouring out, we think, I could die. And I could go into blackness and be gone for the rest of eternity. Whereas an animal...
The great unknown.
Yeah. Whereas an animal, they get cut and they say, this hurts. And I want to stop this hurting. I want to keep it from happening again. But there's no suffering in that. Because suffering comes from being aware of the implications of pain. And so, right now, I'm more in the line of humans are the only thing with consciousness, as far as I understand it.
Yeah. I shut my phone off, sir. Would you mind doing the same?
I can't do it, man. I got people calling.
I know you're a busy man. I think there are studies that have been done on how much pain animals feel, and I think those studies are a reason for a lot of people with knowledge of that literature to be vegetarian these days, is just the understanding that animals do feel that pain when we, slit the necks of chickens, when we slaughter cows and pigs and all that they feel the equivalent. I think it's like pigs feel the equivalent pain of a baby, of a human baby. So, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean they feel suffering. And I think everyone would agree, for the most part today, it's bad to torture animals. They do feel that pain. That pain matters to some degree. But, yeah, so from a completely different perspective, I found it helpful when C.S. Lewis said, as one of his theological books rather than one of his works of fiction, it might have been Mere Christianity, but he said, animals, for some reason and in some way, are here for the purpose of man. That they are here for our pleasure in observing them. They're here for our pleasure in eating them. They sustain us. Like, our bodies react well to consuming them. And so that was just kind of his, like, very say like unscientific, more theological, more just pure awareness take on it. And I found that helpful. I can't really like explain why that might be, but just considering that take is helpful for me in understanding, like a dog, for instance, wants to please man. A bear doesn't a bear doesn't go out of its way to try to like hunt down a human unless he sees like weakness, but there's not bears like outside our windows just waiting to strike, that kind of thing.
There is a weird phenomena of animals not hunting humans.
Yeah.
Like they'll hunt many other things, but they don't actively try to pursue human beings.
They back down real quick.
And I don't know if that's just in their genetic makeup.
They see the squawk.
I don't know if it's in their genetic makeup, just that through the evolution of their species, whenever they've tried to hunt humans, those individuals have been culled from the population. So that genetic impulse is taken out of the population because we kill them all.
Yeah. We talked about background being influential in our decision and our ability to store evidence. So knowing, and you've said already, like you strongly want to believe that there's a God because that is more comfortable to you, or that is a better outcome to you than the alternative. But do you find yourself thinking on two different planes with that when you consider evidence? Like what you just did was you said evolutionarily it could be this way, and that could be purely evolutionary. Do you find yourself thinking on like that purely evolutionary plane, scientific plane, and then like with the possibility of there being a God and there being meaning and there being purpose inherent in reality? Do you find yourself thinking on those like dual planes often, or do you kind of like combine those two in your thinking?
What I try to do, and this is an aspiration, it's hard to get outside of your frame of reference and your filter that you come up in, but what I try to do is initially when I look at something, I try to segment it into different schools of thought. So if we're looking at biblical versus evolutionary frameworks, I try to look at it from both perspectives. I try to go Christian and Darwin essentially, and then I try to see how they can come together and make sense on both fronts.
Because you find truth in Darwinian evolution and you find truth in Christianity.
I think, yeah, I personally feel Darwin's claims to be, for me, undeniable. A lot of them, from the things that I've been exposed to. And I also believe in Christianity and the interpretation of the Bible, so I try and bring those together. But I think that when you're looking at those, you have to kind of compartmentalize them initially. And if we're looking at it from the biblical perspective, I was going to include this as well. In Genesis, it says that we are to be stewards of the environment. And so if you're looking at vegetarian, you don't have to be an evolutionary thinking person. It might even be a hindrance if you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective. But if you look at it from a biblical perspective, we're meant to steward the environment and torturing animals. And I've been moving towards this more so, but even eating them with our modern technology seems a bit gratuitous to me. And if I were very stringent, if I were very adherent to my own principles, I probably would be a vegetarian. It's something that I hope I can try and do eventually. But
because of the pain inflicted on animals?
Because I just feel like it's unnecessary at some point. If we have an alternative to meat, I think that we have a moral obligation to take that. Before Impossible Meats and soy products and all of this, we have the excuse of meat is a necessity to our well-being because it provides nutrients that other things can't give us in those quantities. But now we have alternatives in our modern culture, and I don't see how we can ignore those when there is obvious pain, maybe not suffering, but pain is still a con.
Yeah, it's undesirable in the long term. It is interesting too what you said about like from a purely evolutionary standpoint. It's just like, well, who cares? Who cares, because humans are the masters and we eat whatever we want because we're at the top of the food chain kind of thing.
Baby.
Yeah. And then, so like going back to your question of consciousness, then there seems to have to be some belief that consciousness does matter. And I think with Sam Harris questioning consciousness, I think that is basically him nearly subscribing wholesale to materialism. To just, there's nothing beyond the material world that we see and that we feel. And therefore, consciousness being this somewhat mystical, somewhat undetermined thing, it can't really play into the equation once scientific understanding reaches its pinnacle, kind of thing. That's what I would think about that. But then my kind of rebuttal to that and my reason to remain skeptical about universal truth claims in science is that, one, science itself is self-contradictory in the sense that newer, better methods do away with older, less accurate methods. So there's that continuous progression, and it's not always linear. Like sometimes we go forward 2 steps and take 3 steps back and then go a different route as we gain evidence. So that's one reason I think that I'm skeptical about universal truth claims of science. But the other reason is that we just still know so little about the universe and about reality. I read just like a quick little reference book on physics, and I didn't know much about physics before that. Now I'd say I've scratched the surface. So I'm not claiming like a deep understanding, but from that book, one thing that really stuck out to me is that it's like 24% of the world, or of the universe as we understand it, and we might have mentioned this on a previous episode, but is dark matter, and something like 65% is dark energy, and we know nothing about dark energy. We know some about dark matter, and the other remaining 10% or so, if I did my math right there, is the known universe. So to take 10% that we know well and that we understand, and to make sweeping claims seems dangerous, if not actually irresponsible and it doesn't seem to follow to me. To know 10% and say that's sufficient, because we're talking about sufficient reason, that is sufficient to make sweeping universal claims about reality. But
so first off, I think you brought it in at the end there, and I think that's important, that what I think science is doing is it's saying we have sufficient evidence to make this a priority at this point. And I would hope that we would get those ideas out of there if we have better ideas of what we would like to believe.
Yeah, which definitely is not a negative thing in itself,
right, to
prioritize scientific thought.
And the same thing in religion, obviously. It's gone through that throughout the millennia and on both sides. But yeah, that sufficient reason is the important thing, and to identify what our threshold is. But I want to go back to something that you were talking about a while ago, is consciousness. There's a part in Mere Christianity with C.S. Lewis where he makes an argument that I have an intuitive disagreement with, I guess. is that he gets to a point where he says, like, you can't argue against God because he's the source of your own reason. So in a sense, you're arguing against your own reason. You're arguing against the source of reason to claim that there is not that. You're using your reason to claim there's not a source of reason. And I'm sure it's more subtle than I'm making it out to be. I might not understand it, but with consciousness, what Sam Harris
is a crank.
He's nothing, a mystic.
There's nothing subtle about it. It's just a freaking hack.
But, and to be fair with Sam Harris, I don't think he's discounting consciousness altogether. He's just asking us to look into what we mean by it and really ask if we know that consciousness is a fact. But in correlation with what C.S. Lewis was saying, you're using consciousness to discount consciousness. And so if you get rid of consciousness, then you're getting rid of the thing that's given you the ability to question in the first place. So I thought that was an interesting thing. But
Sam Harris actually mentioned C.S. Lewis in Moral Landscape.
How dare him?
Yeah. Well, he basically said that he quoted something from Mere Christianity and basically said yeah, well, that was a hodgepodge of nonsense. Moving on. And I thought it was funny because a lot of people will read that work specifically and say it just opens up new horizons for them. And you're just yeah, well, that was a bunch of crap. But anyway, yeah, I was kind of gonna go there also and ask the question, to what end are you getting rid of consciousness? Not that it is in our actual power to do so. Consciousness is either there or it is not, and it's a fact of reality. But I'm thinking Sam Harris, his motivation for such work and such thinking to do away with consciousness potentially would be that his grandkids or just the scientific community down the line would say, Harris was right about this, and he helped us in our pursuance of the truth. I think that would have to be his motivation, because I can't really think of any other motivation. It's like when Tolstoy became suicidal after he had written his major works of literature, and he basically said he was experiencing the death of God in his own mind.
It's
essentially
kind of like a postpartum depression too.
Yeah. How so? My wife's about to go through postpartum, so help me understand.
You're going through this great experience and struggle, and it provides so much meaning. And then when that thing is over, you kind of come to a point of what am I going to do next that's better than this, or what am I going to do that's going to provide the same amount of meaning?
Yeah.
And you've kind of pushed the standard up so high that you're trying to reach for it over and over and over again. That's daunting. And that can lead to a resigning yourself to, as far as Tolstoy goes, I'm never going to be able to write War and Peace again.
You wrote it?
What?
You wrote it? That's Leo Tolstoy's your pen name?
Look, don't tell everyone. I don't want to trash Tolstoy. But he's a hack and a forger. But on the pregnancy side, there's obviously a lot of chemical things that are going on, but there's an attachment to that baby.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a connection that's so much deeper than a friendship or even a relationship with someone that's external to you. And when you're separated from that thing, even though it's right in front of you, it's not in you anymore.
Pinker actually had some really interesting commentary on that. He said in Better Angels of Our Nature, which talks about progress through human history, he said that abortion was actually very common through human history, and a lot of times it would be postpartum abortion, because mothers would become pregnant and then abort pre-birth if they felt like they just had no means of supporting this child. And humans through history have lived a much more hardscrabble existence than our current time. And that's one of his arguments in that book specifically, but is that things are getting better and better. But with postpartum depression, he basically said that is something evolutionarily built into us, because so many mothers through time have had to decide if they can take care of their new baby. And so he had plenty of like studies to kind of back that up. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that that's what that means, but it's an interesting possibility. And yeah, I agree. So when a mother gives birth, and because part of that postpartum depression often, from what I've heard, is deciding if you actually like the baby or not.
Oof.
And mothers will say, like, I raised this baby, I fed this baby was completely dependent on me.
But it means nothing to me.
Yeah, well, like, you see the baby when it's in front of you and you're like, kind of like, that's it?
Is this it?
Yeah, like, that's my baby? And then I think, like, the love picks up from there after that momentary postpartum depression.
There's so much hype that goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
So much hype, and then if you don't feel that surge of just uncontrollable and indefinable love at the first moment, you start to feel bad about yourself. Am I a monster?
Mm-hmm.
Am I a monster to not love this thing that came from my womb?
Yeah.
And your brain is going through so many chemical changes so quickly with pregnancy and birth that you're gonna. I'm taking a leap here. Obviously, I'm not going to get pregnant or have been pregnant, but there's got to be moments where you don't feel love for this baby. It's crying for 12 hours.
Yeah. Well, before you were Leo Tolstoy in a past life, you were an Amazonian woman.
Well, yeah,
right?
but we didn't have babies.
Oh, okay.
I was kind of the queen bee.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So the other women had the babies.
And you were just the overlord.
No, the queen bee has all the babies. It doesn't even make sense. But, okay, let's move on.
Yeah. So back to, you haven't given birth, but...
Yeah, but I can understand how guilt and the aspiration not being fulfilled and such and such and such. But I want to get back to sufficient reason. So I thought it was an interesting thought experiment to say, I haven't heard anyone ask Sam Harris, what would be a sufficient argument to believe in God? When I read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion,
I think it might be in the shot right now, potentially. Well, anyway.
But I think he did bring up what would be sufficient proof for the existence of God, and he essentially says there is none. Nothing anyone could say could prove that. So his standard of proof is beyond what anyone could even come up with.
So it would have to be literally God, like, stepping out of heaven.
It would have to be God not being God.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, God is transcendent. And so, to get the type of proof that Richard Dawkins wants, he would have to be corporeal. He would have to be part of the world to provide proofs that are directly accessible.
Weird. That kind of sounds like Jesus. Right? Without being, like, hyper spiritual. I recently heard the argument that the author of a story cannot step into the story that he wrote fully.
He use a lot about Tolkien.
Yeah?
Using apologetics.
Yeah, so I think I heard it from Peter Kreeft, who's a Christian apologist. But he basically said an author cannot fully step into the story unless he writes himself into the story.
But Jesus seemingly left it intentionally vague. So Richard Dawkins wouldn't believe that because, first of all, it was 2,000 years ago. And second of all, Jesus didn't... It seems like Jesus intentionally did not give people that type of evidence.
Yeah, he left people something to wrestle with.
Yeah. But, so Christianity aside, global warming deniers, it would be interesting to ask them, what evidence would you need to believe this?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of evidence, and it gets wishy-washy on how much of it is man-made and how much of it is climate and such and such. But
do you think that like total climate change deniers even are able to receive the information that is presentable? Like I guess my question is, do you think that there are highly educated, learned people who deny outright climate change?
I haven't been exposed to them. I've been exposed to people that say that yes, climate change is real, but it's either a cycle that the Earth goes through, or it's not as big of an issue as people are making it out to be. But I haven't been exposed to any learned person who denies it outright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think like you and I, we're not science. We're not scientists basically. So we could look at a scientific paper on climate change and maybe not be able to flesh it out like perfectly, but we could at least look at the evidence and say like, oh, that's why they're saying climate change has this much effect since the Industrial Revolution, things like that. I just wonder like climate change deniers if they if they might just say like, well, I don't want to see your science. Like I don't want to see your papers. You know what I mean?
I think.
And so.
Flipping sides here, I think it is tiresome when people just say, well, the scientists say it, or are you denying science? And then they don't follow that up with anything.
Yeah.
They say the scientists say this, and then they don't follow it up with anything, and then they act like the person's a troglodyte.
It would be helpful if you provided some kind of like reading material and just say like, read this and get back to me.
But the fact of the matter is that most people take it on faith. They take it from an authority that probably is authoritative and worthy of taking their word for things, but we take it on faith.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so just real quick on climate change. It also just seems common sense that through the course of human history, we made fires. We might have smelted things, but we never had factories all over just shooting like dense smoke into the air. It would seem that you just have to have some kind of very much counterintuitive rationalization to think that that has no effect whatsoever.
Or if you're driving through Iowa and you know that it used to be thick forest, and now, for as far as the eye can see, it's just cornfield. What trees do, in a simplistic way, is that they convert things to oxygen.
Yeah, CO2 to oxygen.
Yeah, and so getting rid of just acres and acres and square miles upon square mile of trees and vegetation and replacing that with a monoculture like just corn or soybeans, it's not going to have no effect. So yes, intuitively, I don't know how people would think that that has no effect, but...
I appreciate the farmers. I'll just say that. And they don't have to be climate change experts to continue doing what they're doing.
Oh, no, right. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they're doing a great thing. But...
What else on sufficient reason that you would like to touch on?
I was going to ask you, what framework do you think people in our time use predominantly to form their beliefs? What types of arguments do are people most susceptible to?
I think based on my own experience, and I have to start with myself on this because I think I'm as guilty as anyone, but I think we are so victim to distractions today that we seem to base our beliefs and our understanding of things a lot on distractions. Like you could call it like the social media culture, or the some people say like the ADD generation, but we just have so many things at our fingertips that it almost seems to me that we are just like grasping at the shiniest thing or the most accessible thing, and we're never diving deeply into things. And I think you could say that basically, like, I mean, just the old adage of, like, comfort breeds laziness, something along those lines. Because, like when I was in grade school, for instance, I would see a page of philosophy. Maybe it was, like, Descartes' Discourse on Method, or something from Kant, or basically these works seem so beyond my range of comprehension at the time, and I realized they're written for adults, and it was like English itself was a different kind of language back then. They weren't necessarily speaking the same language as what we speak today, and you have to like adapt yourself to that language shift. But I think there's a reason why back then they went deeper with things, like Descartes going all the way to the bottom. Philosophers might do that today, but no one really cares. It's like, who do we have as modern day philosophers that are kind of shifting the groundwork of understanding? We still go back to Kant, we still go back to Descartes for good reason, but yeah, to answer your question, what do we base like our where do we get our evidence? What do we base our belief systems on? As I understood your question, I think it's basically, yeah, the thing that is most self-serving, and the thing that is most accessible. Yeah, what do you think about that?
In one of our earlier podcasts, I was really trashing anecdotal stories and anecdotes in general. And I've been wrestling with that for a while since I listened to that podcast. And I think I was very dismissive of anecdotal stories. And I think I ultimately was a little wrong about that, because I think they provide a good framework or a good starting point or ending point to kind of bracket the evidence, the statistical evidence, or just anything that provides a big picture view of it. But saying that, I think that anecdotal stories are what we're hearing more and more and more. I think you just need to look at any political debate or any political political advertisement.
Yep.
It's all anecdotes. And I would be fine. I would be more appreciative of those if they were bracketing statistics and evidence.
Yeah.
But they're not. They're just anecdotal stories.
Do you think it's because they just lose so many people?
I think people would get bored, and I think that when you have a 30-second advertisement, you're not... Those are the things that reach people, and that's kind of what I'm saying, is that is what people are looking for. In our society, politics are going to do what works. And so if you look at politics, I think you're going to find what people are... what people take as a convincing argument.
Not even necessarily the politician's own view, but just what is most expedient to their audience.
It is so depressing for me to watch these politicians that I know are smart people. I know they're very...
Who are we talking about?
Okay. Yeah, let's take Trump out of the picture. Okay, but...
Or his counterpart.
A lot of them...
Anyway.
Okay, yeah, well...
Yeah, anyway,
Joe Biden may be losing a little bit, but I think he's a smart guy. But
yeah, he wasn't at one point.
It pains me to watch them pander to the lowest common denominator. And I see the pain in their face that they have to go to this lower point. Some of them. Some of them love it, but... AOC. But a lot of them are very intelligent people, but they do what's going to convince people. And so I think that's interesting.
Do you think that, just like drawing this into a modern example, you already brought up like COVID-19, is it a big issue or not? There is a surprising amount of people that seem to think it is vastly overblown, that it is something of a conspiracy, and that we're essentially all safe with a few minor exceptions. And so I guess my question, I feel like it's a little self-explanatory, because people, like you said, only like, we'll only go off of anecdotal stories. The best, most recent example of that, by the way, politically that I've heard is, I guess I didn't see this firsthand. I was told it by my soon-to-be birthing wife. but she said that during the Democratic National Convention, this woman got up in front of a camera and said, "Trump killed my dad." Did you hear this?
Yeah, I heard.
That this lady's dad went out in Arizona because his understanding based on Trump's rhetoric was that it was safe to go out, and that somehow that equates to Trump directly killing her father.
Murder.
So it's just like it's just craziness like that is hard to stomach. But anyway, what I was gonna say about COVID is I was gonna ask, what do you think that COVID has revealed, if anything, about the public sentiment, and what we find to be sufficient reason for believing something or not? Do you think it's opened any glaring weaknesses, or do you think it's shown, like, I don't know, unexpected strength in some areas of the population? What do you think that has revealed about human human reason, basically?
I think the most evident thing that COVID has shown us is that the scientists and the politicians that we have been placing our faith in and using them as the trump card, they are fallible too, and they don't necessarily know really what's going on. They may be worth listening to and following their guidelines. We talked about this before in a different podcast, but the mere fact that they originally claimed that masks weren't effective and that we shouldn't be using them shows that not everything they say is true.
Yeah.
And that's provided a very deep divide between the two camps.
Mm.
And so we've kind of just pushed the pendulum in the opposite direction so that we deny their authority instead of picking out what we believe of what they're saying.
Yeah.
But it's really exposed that we need to seriously think about the authority of the people that we're listening to. And unfortunately, I don't think people have been paying as much attention to it as they should, but the importance of statistics and statistics in relation to each other. So, for example, the death per million around the world. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but there have been arguments that are clearly proved wrong if you just look at statistics in relation to other statistics.
Do you mean like comparing countries' numbers of deaths, or?
So what I'm essentially talking about is the deaths per million of the United States compared to other predominant countries in the world. And if you read a lot of stories, you think that the U.S. is just miles and miles worse than any other country. And that could be very true when it comes to cases, confirmed cases. But
or at least reported confirmed cases.
But deaths per million, you can look it up on Google, we're not the top. But, so, and then even confirmed cases in relation to testing. You have to take those and butt them up against each other and then come to your conclusion. And you may come to the same conclusion as when you started. But you have to look at cases in relation to testing, deaths in relation to population, and those aren't the things that I'm seeing in headlines.
Right. Yeah, they're not sexy enough. They're not flashy enough.
No.
It's got to be a story about X amount of people dying.
So the first one, I think people have kind of learned from that. The second one, I hope people eventually learn something from that. Yeah, those are two things that I think we should be learning from.
Have you seen anything related to self-sufficiency or lack thereof? Because I think one of my biggest takeaways, and I want to say this with a large grain of salt, because people are obviously struggling during COVID. There are certain elements of the population that are struggling worse, and there are, variables at play there that cannot be just dismissed. But I've been struck by the level, like when COVID first started, and I'll say this as a caveat. Fortunately, I think both you and I were not in danger of losing our positions, our ways of maintaining income, which is fortunate, and that wasn't true for a lot of people, obviously. But I saw early on, as people started to lose jobs, many people just saying, like, what do I do now? Where do I go? How do I, feed my family, things like that. And it was just striking to me how that was 3 weeks in. Like 3 weeks into the widespread scare, people were saying, what do I do? And that struck me as a system ready to topple when it's shut down for 3 weeks. And that was probably an overblown reaction on the part of many people. There is government assistance. There are resources. We are still a very plentiful country. And other countries will probably struggle worse in the long term than the U.S. will, kind of related to your point. But I just wonder if there should be a return, and kind of like, this is both academic and philosophical, but also very practical. I wonder if COVID should spark a return to self-sufficiency, to where we're not relying on experts' opinions only, but we've done, research on our own. We don't rely on a job exclusively to maintain our lifestyle, but we have some level of self-sufficiency, to where if a 3-week scare happens, or 6-month, 8-month scare happens, where we're currently going into that range, that we that we can persist as human beings without collapsing in on ourselves.
Hopefully that's something people would learn from this and kind of change. I think it's interesting to think about, if this had happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and the government shut down, society shut down, people would be dying of starvation. People would be dying of things that are fundamental needs. And to the best of my knowledge, people aren't dying of starvation in the United States as a result of this.
Do you mean because of like trade shutting down between people back then?
Right. The infrastructure would collapse. So we wouldn't have produce coming from farms. We wouldn't have meat coming from slaughterhouses. And so we may be able to grow it ourselves, and people may have been even better at that in the past. I'm sure they were. But in cities, people wouldn't have access to the infrastructure necessary to provide for their families.
Right.
And so, I think people were very, like you said, people are going through hard times. I'm not denying that at all, but people were very melodramatic about this. And there was a lot of doomsday rhetoric going on.
I went out and bought a big old bag of rice. I don't know about you. Just in case.
And maybe it's better to be overly dramatic than
underprepared.
Than underprepared. So who knows?
Yeah.
But people need to be more self-sufficient. And people need to understand what a need is. We've become accustomed to a certain standard of living. And if something like this happens and we have sufficient reason to shut down for a certain amount of time, people need to be okay with decreasing their standard of living for a certain amount of time. When it comes to expectations toward the government, such things as that. We can't base government subsidies and buyouts on standard of living. if it's not in the cards.
If that standard is, at least for the time being, unattainable.
Right.
On a large scale.
Right.
Yeah.
Obviously, people should be getting food. People should be getting a certain amount of medical attention. But other things like cell phones and something I need to do more of, and obviously everyone needs to assess their framing when it comes to assessing propositions. And look at if you're okay personally with the standards you're using to believe what you believe, from an evolutionary perspective, from a religious perspective, and also look at the framing that you have personally is going to be the framing that you're going to use when you're trying to present these propositions to others. And if your framing isn't rigorous and isn't based upon thorough thought, you might be okay with that, but you're not going to reach anyone.
Yeah.
If that's what you want to do, if you want to convince someone about climate change, if you want to convince someone about providing a better life for their family, if you're trying to convince someone that Jesus Christ is the only way to get to heaven, then you have to give them sufficient reason to believe those things.
By their own standards.
Right.
Often. From their own viewpoint.
I said it before, come to the Greek as a Greek and the Jew as a Jew.
Yeah. Great. All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope to, again, do it down the road.
Great time once again, bro.
Yep, it has been sufficient.